It's loading. And we are live.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for your patience if you've been waiting for the stream to begin. We're excited to be with you this evening. My name is Emma Mulvaney-Stanak, and I am a candidate for state representative in Chittenden District 6-2. That's in Burlington, Vermont, between the Old North End and New North End part of Burlington. Very excited tonight to moderate the Progressive Party's panel on Vermont education and economic justice and how the two issues really are intersectional. Social justice as well as economic justice comes up in any conversation, or should, in public education. And we're excited tonight to be joined by a couple of fellow state representative candidates this evening, as well as educators who work in the public schools here in Vermont. And the panel actually has perspectives from all over the state. Every corner of the state is going to be represented tonight. So very excited to get going. The last thing I'll just say is that as a former labor organizer for the teacher and support staff union in the state, I've had the real privilege to work around the state in virtually every school district over a decade. And every Vermont community is very unique, and yet there's very similar challenges facing the survival of small rural schools, the inequities that have existed before COVID but are only really being the veil has been pulled back for some folks to realize all of the struggles that are facing many families and students and the barriers to their success. And yet here we are in this big moment, this transitional moment in life, living through a pandemic, living through a lot of uprising around racial justice, to really think outside of the possibilities that we have, I think, traditionally thought through around public education. So in this conversation, I hope we'll get there, around exploring the opportunities that are in front of us in Vermont to rethink how we do public education, to think about the intersections with bringing economic justice and social justice into these schools and really elevating the good work that's been there already, as well as really being real and honest around the barriers that still exist and the hard work ahead as we move from surviving the pandemic to recovery and then hopefully true transformation to really strong public schools. So with that, we're going to have each of our panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get down into the conversation. So first, we're going to, let me just look at my list here. First, we're going to hear from state representative candidate out in Essex Town, Tanya Vyhovsky. Welcome, Tanya.
Thank you, Emma. So my name is Tanya Vyhovsky. I am running for state representative in Essex, Chittenden 8-1. I am also a social worker, and I work in my town, in my private practice, mostly with youth, as well as in the Charlotte Central School, where I see the intersections of education, economic, and social justice pretty regularly. I mean, that so frequently the work that I am doing is working to help individuals who are in some way oppressed by our systems navigate our school systems. The vast majority of the folks that I find myself supporting in my social work practice are, all of them really, are being failed by some of our systems. And it's really why I decided to run for office, sitting in my practice feeling like I was putting band-aids on these systemic issues, sending people back out into a world that still didn't work for them, started to feel irresponsible. And it started to feel like that our legislative work needed to be informed by what was happening on the ground with people who were struggling economically or being oppressed in many different ways across our state. And so that drove me to say, hey, I have the skills and can bring these voices to the table so that we can build systems that allow all of us to thrive.
Great, thanks, Tanya. And thanks for being here tonight from Essex. We're gonna head up to Franklin County and welcome Jamilah Vogel, who's a St. Albans, I believe in the St. Albans elementary level, school guidance counselor. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me here. I'm really honored to be part of this conversation with dedicated people who are working towards issues that I care a great deal about. I actually live currently in Winooski, Vermont, but I do work as a school counselor in a pre-K through 8 school at the St. Albans City School in St. Albans, Vermont, Franklin County. The unceded territory of the Abenaki Nation of Missisquoi. I came to equity and social justice work many, many years ago. I've had served many roles as an educator I've done the work more or less well, hopefully more well as I become more experienced and gain knowledge. I currently serve as the chair of the Equity Committee for the Maple Run Unified School District. And I am also fortunate to be involved in the Equity Practitioners Network through the Vermont Principals Association, which has allowed me to connect with a lot of really fantastic and dedicated educators and network and learn from one another. And through this past several tumultuous months, it has become more and more clear to all of us how economic justice and education really are, as Emma put it, intersectional. And we see, firstly, the ways in which our economy rests on school in ways that can be oppressive and that are not really functional or sustainable. And we also see very clearly, more so than ever right now, how the existing inequities are magnified when we face tragedy, we face an upheaval, and school closing definitely shed, kind of put a huge magnifying glass on the impacts of economic oppression and racial oppression, oppression of our students on the LGBTQ community who lost a safety net when schools closed. So it really helped us to see more clearly if anyone was struggling to see what inequities exist. And I'm excited to talk more about that as we proceed this evening.
Great, thank you so much. And now we'll head over to, where's my list again? Sorry. And then we'll head over down to Windsor to hear from another state representative candidate in the Windsor district, Elizabeth Burrows.
Thank you. Thank you for holding this evening, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. My name is Elizabeth Burrows. I live in West Windsor, or also known as Brownsville, and I hope to represent the Windsor 1 district, which is Windsor, Heartland, and West Windsor. I am a cis married mother of 2 who both of my children are currently in school, but at the moment I speak to you as the chair of our local school board district and also a member of our supervisory union. I've been on the school board for 7 years, and I started at one school board, had to drag our town through the Act 46 consolidation process, and now we are part of a merged district. And professionally, prior to my life in Vermont, I was a homeless rights advocate. I worked for ACORN, for Habitat for Humanity. I've worked in civil rights in Prague on the Romani population, or with the Romani population. I've been a domestic violence advocate, and I worked on an indigent defense bill, and I'm a pastoral care volunteer. And I'm looking forward to talking about, it feels like we have a lot of areas of the state represented, but I think on this panel, I'm the only person who comes from a small district with a really small school, or one of our 2 schools is very small. And so I think that's what I have to bring to this panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, I mean, it's a really, the breadth and diversity within Vermont, just in terms of school size and rural versus Vermont urban, if you will, is really one of the issues that hopefully we'll get a little bit into, because there's commonalities and there's things that are very unique around the needs of a Chittenden County school district or Franklin County urban district, or even a large town like Bennington and Essex town versus small towns. Well, let's hear from our last panelists just for introductions, and then we'll get it right into the questions. So let's hear from Kris Hansen from down in Bennington.
Hi, I'm Kris Hansen, and I'm a National Board Certified teacher. I have 24 years of experience in secondary English education. I am a candidate for the Doctor of Education, Educational Leadership through the Southern New Hampshire University's Vermont campus. And I have been an active union leader where Emma and I have had lots of time spent together. And I have spent the last several months working with fellow Vermont NEA members on the Vermont NEA reopening task force. And I think that's a good place to talk about where a lot of my work with education and economic and social justice has been brought to the fore through this pandemic right now. As you mentioned in the introduction to the panel tonight, Emma, I think that COVID-19 is really pulling back the curtain on the inequity that has existed for decades in education. And we're really seeing that nationwide, but here in Vermont as well, in lots of different ways across our districts, in the way that different SUs have been able to deliver their pandemic learning right now. You can drive around Vermont and see which schools are able to put tents outside to allow for outdoor education, for airflow and safe learning, and which schools are hybrid, and which schools like mine have high school have stayed remote because we don't have a building that is appropriate for students to return in person. And I think this time has just shown that we need to think differently. And that's really a big part of the work that I've done over my years in education and what my doctoral research is about. So I'm really interested in exploring these ideas tonight with people here.
Great. Thank you, Kris, so much. It is very interesting. There's capital issues within districts around upkeep of campuses for safe learning and working environments, just health-wide, even before we got to the pandemic of COVID-19. There are issues of the cost to local communities, the moratorium that's been put on school construction from the state aid in terms of being a partner and shouldering the cost for local districts. There's a lot, even just on the capital needs of districts, let alone the socioeconomic and emotional needs of students and the families that they serve. So let me pose the first question to the two educators on the call, and this will be to Kris and Jamilah. Jamilah, so I'm wondering if you could get into, and Jamilah, let's go to you first. What's new thinking that has emerged in your mind, at least, in your work in the schools around how education connects to economic justice, and if there's anything in particular that's policy oriented, because here we are a moment to maybe be with three hopeful state representatives soon, but things that might be stuff that we should really be thinking on a statewide level, a policy connection, and what you've been new thinking you've been grappling with.
I don't know that I would call any of the thinking new thinking as much as I would call it clearer thinking around specifically the multiple roles that schools have been playing and the ways that school has been kind of a fix-all for a lot of economic injustices that our communities face. So when healthcare funding is cut, schools increase the kind of services that we provide in school around healthcare. When childcare services are underfunded, schools offer increased preschool, increased after-school care. When parents rely on two incomes, whether that is two people working in the home or a person working multiple jobs or multiple people working multiple jobs, when we don't have livable wages, the burden on schools to provide consistent child care increases. When social services are cut, schools try to fill those gaps. We have social workers working in our school. We try to provide clothing. We try to provide medical care. So schools are trying to fill in the gaps where economic injustices exist in our communities, and it's not sustainable. And we've seen that more clearly when schools had to close and all of the things that went away with school. So when we're thinking about policy, we need to be ensuring that those services, those robust community services, are being supported and being funded. We also need to be looking at school funding. School funding has long been one of the forces that that continue to support oppression, to continue to support inequity, to continue to cause a form of community segregation through unfair school funding practices. So I think in terms of policy, we need to be looking at, one, what are the social services that schools are filling in for, and how do we fund those? And two, how do we fund schools in a more fair manner? I think we also need to talk about racial justice and the importance of racial justice, and those who were not noticing, awake, cued into racial justice before in the way that we are now are coming on board, and schools are embracing the importance of racial justice education and anti-racism education more potently than we have before. And so when we're looking at what we've learned in the last 6 months and how we might look at policy, I think we need to continue to focus on equity, and there are some really good initiatives that were started pre-COVID in our state around ethnic studies and equity literacy standards. And I would hope to see those things to continue and not be on the back burner in the midst of everything else we're trying to sort through.
Great, thank you. Yeah, a lot there to start to sort of seed the conversation ahead around school funding and equitable models that might be worth reimagining or examining, as well as really looking at the hidden costs that schools have started to absorb when basic human needs are not being met, right? Schools have absorbed, as you were saying, a lot of these human needs for basic survival for a lot of families. As well as the racial justice piece. So a lot to dive in there. So Kris, I wonder if any of that resonated for you, and or new or slight variations of that from Bennington.
Yeah, these are all very similar to, there's statewide issues. There are definitely the issues that are going on in my town. We need to focus on social services for sure. Pre-pandemic, our school systems have been leaned upon for so many things, and now that is just being so brought to the forefront as students are not in schools, and then as many of our families are out of work, and what that is, the stresses that is causing upon our communities. I think that our schools are going to be a place that is going to be even more needed to be a center for providing these kinds of services. I have a concern that as we become, there's going to be more talk about tightening the belt at the state level in terms of funding, and the model we have for funding education. People are going to say we can't raise taxes, we can't pay anymore, and so what's going to happen to fund schools? I think about now in my SU, we already have year after year after year tightened our belts. And so to continue to be asked to do that, and yet our community has more and more needs, I find that a great concern. I think specifically now we're operating in under short staffing conditions, yet we need to do more. in the times of COVID-19. So again, I think about what schools that have more economic advantages are able to offer right now during pandemic times versus those that don't. I was very struck by something that was posted last night in a discussion in the Boston Public Schools about inequity by Dr. Ibram Kendi. And he said that it's often the children who have the least in their homes who have the least in their schools. And it's an ongoing crime. And he was speaking to the school board to say that they have the power to begin to change that. And I look to you all as, you know, potential future leaders in the Vermont political landscape to have the power to change that. And I think it's long past time that we change that for our kids, for the future of Vermont.
Thanks, Kris. What a powerful quote to bring into the space from Dr. Kendi around really succinctly putting it that often the kids, if not most of the time or all of the time, who have the least resources, the most under-resourced students and families are in schools that are the most under-resourced, the ones who really need a recentering of both attention and resourcing. It's really what you pay attention to grows, what you don't pay attention to really flounders and is harmed by our system.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's okay to follow up on that, to connect
Go
that
for it.
to Jamilah bringing in racial justice, because there is a wonderful resource called Courageous Conversations About Race, the author Glenn Singleton. I find that a really powerful work. And what he does in schools, Singleton makes it very clear that it's not just a question of socioeconomic dialogue, that race is also at the forefront of this, that without question, he says, poverty impacts students. But if when you look at the research, students who, that the racial achievement gaps are great, and that we must continue to have these deep dialogues in our state about racial justice. And we do have the beginning of that with the Act 1 that was passed. But I feel that I worry that we are under such stress as educators. And when you bring in Act 77 and you bring in, Act 46, and when is there going to be time to give us to stop and say, how is this work going to be done? So as much as we're having discussion about what are the needs and what can, I love that you're asking us, what can we do? In some ways, I wonder if it's, don't do anything more. Let's just focus on the good things that we've done already and pause and give us all time to dig in and support this work that we've begun, because educators are overwhelmed, and I think we need to do this work due diligence.
Thank you, Kris. And thanks for centering racial justice again, because I think that's such a critical, another intersection point to really grapple with in Vermont in all the systems, and really looking at systemic change. But public education is one of those really necessary ones to look at, and leave it to an educator to start doing citations in terms of really giving us resources.
That's the researcher in me right now.
I know, I love it. I love it. But it's really important, because I think the more we learn, the better we can be around really being able to create, in terms of political courage, courageously questioning policies and funding formulas and lack of community dialogue around issues of racism within our schools, when we are better informed, when we're truly doing our homework and thinking deeply in these ways. And just for folks who aren't familiar with Act 1, it was the ethnic studies curriculum working group, essentially, that was formed to look at Vermont's curriculum and to create recommendations, since Vermont it creates standards, but it's not required of school districts. It's a step in the right direction to make sure that history and curriculum reflects all parts of our history and our communities and culture, and not a skewed white-centered curriculum. Well, a lot to unpack there. There's some great policy ideas that are put forward by our educators on the call tonight. And let's switch over to our candidates to see what resonates, what you've been thinking already around with some of these policy ideas that Kris and Jamilah have put forward, and as well as just some of your own thoughts around things the state legislature should be considering. So let's go to Tanya first. Tanya, what was resonating? What hits home? What are other new ideas you'd like to bring in?
I mean, so much of what was said really hits home. As someone who is based in our school system and working to support people as we closed and to support people as we reopened, so much of what's been mentioned is what I see. We saw teachers asked to figure out how to feed the children who needed to be fed, provide essential childcare, and teach online. There you go, have fun, no guidance. And that's not fair. And we're watching our teachers being asked to do that again as we welcome children back into the schools. I will say that as my role is usually to support some of our highest need kids, and I'm still doing that. But what I'm seeing the most right now is our teachers are struggling. We are asking our teachers to do twice as much with no more hours in the day and no additional support. In fact, in many instances, they have less. And so I think that it is astronomically important that we look at how, yes, we need to do all of this important work, but we need to look at how we provide for our teachers. Because what I am known for saying throughout our school building is that if we want to have healthy children, we need to have healthy adults. So we have to make that investment. And I would, in terms of funding, we are going to be faced with some really tough stuff and a lot of push for austerity budgeting, and we have to resist that. We cannot continue to cut essential services and think that our communities will be okay. We cannot cut education funding and think that our children will be okay. Yes, these are investments, and that is monetary investment, and it costs money, but they're investments in our future. They're investments in where we go from here with healthy children and healthy communities. And that prevents human cost, but in the long run, it's economically more responsible. What we're pointing to with asking healthcare to be provided in schools and childcare to be provided in schools is a long-term underinvestment in our communities. And so we absolutely must fight against austerity budgeting and ensure that we are making the critical community investments to prevent later crises down the road. I think we also have to fundamentally change our education funding model. The property tax-based system is inequitable, and it helps lend itself to the fact that our schools that need the most have the least. It points to exactly what we have been talking about. And it makes it unaffordable for a lot of people to live here, whereas currently, we have about 2/3 of our population paying in an income sensitive way, but we could ask that other 1/3, which are some of the richest people in this state, to pay their fair share. And that would allow us to lower that burden and unlink our education funding from property taxes, which would create more equity within our schools and more equity in how we paid for our schools. It also, the last time was looked at, would influx close to $80 million into our education fund without asking people who are already strapped to pay more. It would be asking people who have more than they need to pay their fair share. And so I think that when I think about what we're all talking about, those are some critical pieces in how we make the investments in our schools and our communities to ensure that our children and our teachers are provided for, and that we can invest in safe school buildings, high-speed broadband, so we don't have teachers and children in their cars learning and teaching because they don't have access to that at home. It allows us to just truly invest in building out a safe and equitable school system. The reality of it is, in my work as a social worker, when we are asking our schools to feed children breakfast and provide healthcare and provide mental health care, we're actually taking away from our teachers. We don't prepare our teachers for that, and we're taking away from their capacity to teach, and we're taking away from the children's capacity to learn. So we need to make those investments.
Thank you, Tanya. Really making the case of understanding, if it hasn't been put on blast for folks, that educators are essential workers. They are frontline workers. They always have been in our communities. And I'll also just lift up the support staff. So the paraeducators, the custodians, the folks who keep the campus running and do the one-on-one support often with a lot of these under-resourced students we're talking about, as well as the really hard working educators and school leaders within the schools. It really, that essential, if we can reframe, it's been interesting these moments during the pandemic where there's almost these like different opportunities to suddenly, for a lot of folks, I'm just talking sort of generically here, but suddenly realizing the incredible value of what schools were providing every single day, right? And the food sourcing, the just general resourcing, the ability to know what was going on for a family and supporting them. And how we've been funding it is a big thing to untangle, and to understand a lot of the way we've been funding it has hidden the costs, the true costs of the human service needs that schools have been sort of backfilling for decades now. And this is absolutely not the time to tighten belts and to take funding away, but indeed that would create more harm instead of really taking it as an opportunity to analyze what has not been working and get real and have honest conversations about what we need to be doing. So Elizabeth, I'm wondering, a similar question to you, what's resonating, what's other new thinking around policy that you're hoping to bring to the State House on what we've been talking about?
Well, one thing that I was thinking about just in responding to Jamilah and Kris was that the Agency of Education put out a study that looked at the it was called the Weighting Impact Study, and it looked at how the equalized pupil funding formula, which they didn't actually define over the course of this study, interestingly, it looked at how the money that was supposed to be allocated weighted for different things like elementary versus middle versus secondary school, geographic necessity, population density. These are all the part of the factors that go into the equalized pupil count. And what they found was that even though they used all these different factors, none of the money that they said was being spent was actually being spent in the way they said it was being spent. What they found was that there are so many different types of human services that are being offered by schools that it totally made irrelevant the pupil weighting. And I attended a forum that was kind of an analysis of this study that was done by the University of Vermont, in which they suggested that because psychological services, social services are so costly to school systems, that they suggested, and that they are so much more in need at the moment, they suggested increasing funding for social services by 297%, and also removing them from the education budget altogether and moving them to a different budget. And they felt that in doing so, they could actually really easily balance like the burden of all of those costs for every single school in the state of Vermont. If that burden was lifted, that schools might actually be able to thrive, not just survive, but thrive. Another thing was Jamilah listed off a whole bunch of different things that schools do, and the many, many roles of schools. And one that I think has really been in the last 6 months, you left out providing food. And since we've been able to provide food for every single student in the state of Vermont, it's really taken off the stigma of having to apply for it. And the number of people who have taken advantage of the food provision, not just during the shutdown, but even in this year, has really been incredible. And I think it really, the teachers at our schools have said that because of the nutrition difference, it's actually made a huge difference to, because they're providing breakfast and lunch. It's actually made a huge difference to the students' ability to focus. And I think that's, I don't know whether we'll be able to continue that. And then should I be part of the legislature? I don't know if we'd be able to continue that during the next budget cycle, but it seems like a really easy thing to, it's low hanging fruit. And if they're hoping in our district that they'll show that scores are actually lifted up by it. And likewise, scores being lifted up. I was going to say with regards to the ethnic studies bill, I was one of the people who did what I could to help it along. And one of the bits of research that I found was on when Washington passed their ethnic studies bill. I think they were the first of the 3 states on the West Coast that did it. And they originally did it to include Native American studies in their curriculum. And they had a budget of $38,000 for the whole state of Washington to implement it. But what they found was that implementing it actually lifted up all students. It lifted all of their test scores of all identities. I don't know whether that's because they had to throw out the old curriculum and make something that was actually relatable. That could be why everybody had better scores. There's no, they haven't looked at that, but anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to go over.
No, Elizabeth, it's fine. And we're not apologizing because, it's my new quest in life that women in particular should never apologize for taking up space and bringing wisdom into the room. And Kris, I'll give the floor to you just a second. One thing that I do know about, I forget if it was Washington or Oregon, I believe it was Oregon, but it ties into a lot of what has been raised so far around this, in this small case, the ethnic studies curriculum, is the big question of how do we implement, a new initiatives or new thinking in the state, and how do we resource it? Because it's one thing as a state legislature to advance and pass policies, in this case, Act 1, and hope for the best. But then missing the point is when you then not provide the resourcing for adequate implementation. So, experts to be called upon at the AOE to help school districts who want to grapple and get into the details and figure out how to do it well, and not leaving it yet another thing up to the local district to implement and to figure out on their own. And then have, I forget how many districts there are now, 60 plus districts or SUs, each have their own version of it. Sometimes is perhaps not the most effective way to be implementing really important and critical policies such as ethnic studies. And we probably could go down the list around things that are not well resourced and not well supported, as the AOE being a center of experts to help the local school districts and educators. So Kris, I'm going to give you back the floor. So I think you wanted to add something in before we move on.
I just sort of wanted to kind of tie together some of the things that we've brought up with what Elizabeth was mentioning about. I'm interested to kind of look up the UVM analysis of that, and then this idea of I appreciate, Elizabeth, that you'd like to support the food programs that we have in place. But I question our immediate, this is kind of the default in education to say, let's see if we can see an improvement in our test scores. I'd like to say, can we see an improvement in children's mental health? Can we see an improvement in the joy? Can we see an improvement in the reduced amount of stress, like Tanya was talking about? We need to start thinking about the amount of stress and what our educators are dealing with right now. We really need to think about caring for the caretakers of the children of our state. And all of these things go back to, I think, all of the issues that we've brought up, in that I don't think we need new initiatives. We should be thinking about personalized learning. We already have Act 77. So how can we be implementing that in a more effective way? And right now, with we need to reimagine education in light of needing new modes of delivery during hybrid learning, during remote learning, in light of pandemic times. And then if you think about racial justice initiatives and Act One and, ethnic studies, all of these things, I'm going to go back to Glenn Singleton's work, who points out that if we work on equity, all students benefit from this. All students benefit from equity work, because what equity does is that it works to address the needs of the individual child. And if we can then do something about funding that, all of these things tie together. And I think we just need to bring some new energy, some new vision into these great ideas. Vermonters are known for that innovation and those great ideas. We've put it out there already. Let's just dig in and see what we can do with what's already there and build on those strengths.
Thanks, Kris. Let's keep going, because I think you all want to weigh in. So we'll go to Jamilah first, and then to Tanya, then back to Elizabeth. Go for it.
Yeah, I'm really resonating with what Kris is saying about not adding more, but doing what we're doing in a deeper and more thoughtful way. I will say, when it comes to social justice and education, I really do want to see some expectations and standards around that. And I really want to look at an examination of Common Core and how Common Core impacted social studies and history education. And I'm working with middle school students right now who have such gaps in their understanding of who we are and where we are. And we need to be weaving that back into our education in some kind of a structured way. And we also don't need to be thinking about anti-racism education as another thing, right? We need to be thinking about how do we weave this in seamlessly into who we are and what we do, and how do we develop that critical lens so that in all of our planning and all of our conversations and all of our thinking about how we're educating kids, we have that equity lens, not just limited to race, although I focus a lot on racial equity and think it's hugely important. But how do we weave that equity lens into all of the initiatives, all of the funding decisions, that should be in the front of our minds at all times.
Thank you, Jamilah. Some really great points in there around not putting racial justice in a silo over here and yet another initiative, but weaving it in and bringing it into everything that we do. Because when we do dismantle the systems of harm, such as racism and hunger, it does benefit everyone. Like, we all do better. We all truly will be liberated from systems that are harmful to anyone. Tanya, I think you wanted to go next, and then we'll go to Elizabeth.
I did. I also wanted to talk about the importance of weaving equity across all of these conversations. And I also really wanted to talk about the personalized learning. One of the things we know is that there isn't a one size fits all answer. And one of the things that I see with the kids in my office, both at school and in my community, is a lot of times these are children and families who the one size we currently have, in fact, doesn't fit. And I have struggled to work within the school system and outside of the school system to really build that personalized learning. And I know that there's so much on everyone's plate, but when I think about kids who actually did really well in remote learning, or kids who right now are doing really well because we're doing a lot of our learning outside with activity, and really thinking about how we build out an equitable system across the board that meets all of our students where they're at. I also work with plenty of kids who did not do well in remote learning. And so really just thinking, like, what we've really seen is that one size doesn't fit all. And we can weave these things throughout, and everyone does thrive. A person who thrives learning in the classroom is not going to be harmed because they get some extra activity working out, doing some learning outside. But I think we can really build out a much more holistic education system that is really grounded in personalized learning and equity. And I think that generally we need to move away from test scores as how we gauge success. We moved in this direction that pushed us into this space of, like, one size fits all, let's do these test scores. And we moved away from like holistic learning. We moved away from really teaching critical thinking and really teaching all of the things that we're talking about here. And so I'd really like to see us think about how we build holistic systems that are grounded in equity and justice. The other thing that I think is really critical that we think about as we're thinking about equity and justice, and became particularly apparent during remote learning, was our special education community and our students with disabilities, and how we make sure that our holistic systems fully bring those students' voices into how we do this. And I think sometimes the way we do that is by welcoming the student voices. I have seen some students in my community doing amazing equity work. There's a high school senior in the Essex community that was featured on CNN for the equity work she is doing right here in Essex, Vermont. She just barely turned 17 years old and is sitting on the school board and is starting equity groups in our school and our whole community. And so I think that we also need to welcome our student voices to help us vision our education system forward.
Wouldn't it be interesting, right? There's a lot of school boards that have youth representatives on it. What would happen if we gave them an actual vote, right? And we really radically changed how those students get selected, et cetera. I mean, there's opportunities everywhere. Elizabeth, I'm going to pass it over to you. I think you also wanted to weigh in.
We talked about that on our board, but we decided that we're all elected to the board, and we're elected to represent our communities. The students would have to be elected onto the board in order to be able to do it. I don't see why they can't, but it's a bigger process than it seems. I want to clarify something, and that is that ironically, because we're talking about food and nutrition and its effect on students, ironically, I think that it's because I'm super hungry that I even mentioned test scores, because I'm actually not a proponent of test scores at all. One of the school in our town that our sons go to has 60 kids in it, and I constantly and consistently challenge the validity of percentages in a school that has fewer than 100 students. You can't even call each grade a true cohort. So yeah, I apologize for blurting that out. I don't know what it wasn't what I was. That's not where I am. Yeah. So.
No worries, Elizabeth. I mean, well, you know what I think it really does show, though, is for years we were, overwhelmed with narratives around No Child Left Behind, and the only metric that means anything are testing, and then the serious amount of money, frankly, private interest and money, let's be real, that's been pumped into school systems, and the ways to make schools look like they're, quote, failing to justify privatizing public education. It's not just by chance that our brains get wired that way. We've been swimming in this kind of culture for a long time.
You know what? Like, now it's 2020. Like 4 years ago, it turned out that what's the name of the math test? That it's not the kneecap. They don't do the kneecap anymore. Whatever the standardized math test is. They gave it during the week. They gave it in successive days. And it turned out at our school that it was right during the stomach flu season. And all of the teachers were out. And it's the it's the exam where if you don't participate, you average in a 0. And we averaged I think there were only 4 students in one of the classes. And yet that was our school's grade for that year was based on this horrific attendance having nothing to do with actual anything. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad we're on testing, because I mean, there's a lot to go there with within testing. So Tanya, let's go to you next, and then we'll go to Kris.
Yeah, one of the things that I want to point to is the bias within standardized tests. We know that these have been applied in ways that are not equitable, whether that be racial justice or economic justice. I was just looking at some data the other day that looked at the SATs and the economic range for scores. The average scores were highly correlated to the economic status that a family was in, and they are in fact expensive. And when I think about it, when I work with students who can pay for classes and pay for tutoring versus students who are working jobs to help put food on their family's table, there's no possible way that they wouldn't be economically biased. And we also know when we look throughout history that they're racially biased, not just in the way that the questions are structured, but in how the information is presented. So not only are we sorry, I get distracted by the chat.
Real talk. No one else in 2020 has ever been distracted by a Zoom chat, Tanya. Just you.
Never once. But not only are we funneling a huge amount of money into that, we are like setting up this systemic poverty and this systemic impacts of racism, because that is what we're basing success on. And I spend so much time talking to students saying, well, what do you base success on? Tell me about what's important to you, which brings us back to this personalized learning. You know, when I work with a student who's nearly failing out of school, who then is able to tell me how important science and botany is to him, and 2 years later isn't going to college, that wasn't because of tests. Like, that was because we got to that student. So I so appreciate, Kris, what you said about like really focusing and grounding on mental health and social emotional learning. We can't do any of the rest of it if we don't have that base level need met. When we just think about the hierarchy of needs, if students do not feel safe, seen, heard, they can't do the bigger learning, and they certainly can't sit down and take a test.
Well said, like a social worker would say. Kris, do you want to weigh in next?
Yeah, I was just going to, I mean, Tanya's really, right on the same page with Tanya with her school counseling role, and working with students. The testing issue is something that, especially right now with the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic, whatever is ahead for us in the future with this, are going to be felt for a long time. And we still have not heard, as far as I know, whether we are going to be released from state assessments. And that is something that I think our State Board of Education, and even the number of days we need to be in school, all of these things are important to be reimagining in terms of education. And the legislation that needs to be done around this is very important moving forward. I don't think it's important anymore. The seat time issues, these standardized testing ways of measuring students' learning, these need to go by the wayside, let alone, as Tanya has brought up, the racial issues, the racial justice around standardized testing. As I mentioned, Dr. Kendi's comments around issues around this in Boston just last night, they're tied to the standardized testing came out of the eugenics movement. So there's some serious things to consider here. And we need to be released in our state from state testing right now. We need to see some strong movement towards that. And this idea of the mental health of our students right now, this is a big part of it. And the stress on teachers and the mental health of teachers is very important. And personalized learning, I'm just going to go back to that again. For Vermont to be a leader with Act 77, we need to go back to that and really think about what the intention of that was. The pandemic is a perfect time during this kind of hybrid learning, remote learning, to be doing personalized learning And I think there is too much of a fear that we need to keep doing the same thing because of these kinds of measurements like SATs and things. So this is the perfect time to be doing this kind of re-envisioning, reimagining. And I just hope that we can get more progressive legislators to join in this kind of discussion. And I just want to make one last statement to get get the educators involved like this tonight in the dialogue, because there's just this feeling that everything is decided without us on board. And that's nationwide, not just in Vermont, that we get told what we're supposed to do next, not ever asked in this kind of forum. So thank you for asking.
Yeah, of course, Kris. I mean, those impacted should be the ones making the decisions. They should be at the table. And I think it's, to sort of just bring it home a little bit, it's not only just an opportunity to criticize what has not been working and to bemoan all the problems and, everything is falling apart, but to really like lean into imagining what is possible in this moment. There are these cracks, but there's almost like sunlight coming through to show that there's some other possibilities to be out there. And it takes, again, political courage. It takes educator courage. It takes youth to be courageous and say these old mental models don't serve us anymore. Testing, old funding models, systems that we know are harming students, especially certain parts of our student population. This is the time to challenge that and to just be really honest about things have not been working for a long time, and it's time to redress those harms and to start articulating what else could happen. Jamilah, I think you wanted to add in something before we start to wind down.
Yeah, and it may feel like a little bit of an aside, but it really isn't. So one of the things that has been really made clear recently is in the hybrid model in my school is the benefit of small class sizes. We have a smaller group of kids for less days and more learning is happening. And the joke kind of in the school is like, who knew small class sizes would be effective? Like every educator ever knew. And to Kris's point, like if you want to know how to create good educational policy, equitable educational policy, ask educators. So the idea that of sitting here with prospective legislators who are also educators is very, very exciting and very, very important. And when we start to think really creatively about challenging the number of days kids might need to be in school, the kinds of services that school are providing, class sizes, and then we start thinking about those budgetary decisions and this austerity funding, what we really need to be challenging is the fact that our broken capitalist system rests on the back of schools, which means our broken capitalist system rests on the backs of children. And that is unacceptable. And that's a big ask to challenge that, but that's what we need to be doing. We need to be doing that in our legislation. We need to be doing that in our schools. So I think that's really the crux of it. We're not going to see real change until kind of the fat cat's up sitting on our kids' backs.
And frankly, stop, influencing public policy to take public dollars further away from what actually is going to best serve, communities and students, right? So through testing, I love that you raised your hand, Elizabeth. That's such like a school thing to do. I'll get to you in just a second. But to truly to challenge that, to ask these critical questions, and not to always leave it up to state legislators, but to demand that of whoever your legislator is, right? To make them ask those questions in those rooms, to get on the floor, to get in the committee, whether it be in Zoom in the next couple of months or whatever it's going to look like, we'll find out. But yeah, there's a lot there. So I do have a final question I'm going to wrap us up with, but Elizabeth, why don't you go ahead and then I'll come back.
Well, I was just going to say kind of tangentially that we in small towns with small schools have to fight to stay alive, to keep our schools open. And it really, when you think about the state of Vermont as an aging state, the kind of corollary to that is that we don't depend enough on our young people, and our state government doesn't depend enough on educating its young people to draw more people into the state. When a town loses its school, towns without a school die and towns with schools grow. And so the state refuses to do a study to look at the long-term effect of school closure, but actually when a town loses its school, it loses its tax base. And then you find pockets of towns that, of the small towns that die because they've lost their school. And also, conversely, during times like this, it's the little schools that are really able to run around in the woods. And as you said, Kris, they're able to be outside and do all kinds of things, and they have tiny classes, and they don't really have to worry about the schools reopening. And so why wouldn't we support that?
Thanks, Elizabeth. All right, so I'm going to ask just a final question. Whenever you can sort of enter back in space, you can take this in whatever direction you want as we close out here our time together. But you know, to sort of imagine into the future together, tomorrow or a year from now, or however you want to take it. But what is possible? Like, what is possible to put out there in the space for those who might be listening tonight, who might view this later on, around education policy, which can feel really wonky. But in general, what if we state it, you know, in many ways, we put it out there for its possibility of it gaining traction and getting more folks to kind of really have it resonate with other people. So from each of your perspectives, what is possible in this work for education justice? And Kris, I'll start with you, and then I'll go around.
I was just thinking, I'm gonna have to think about that one. I feel like we've been through a lot of different issues here, you know. I think, to me, if I could, I recently asked I've been doing some work around generative questions. And I said, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you like this to look like, you know, a year from now or something? And, you know, I'm going to kind of do that. And I would like for us to be able to, in this education landscape of today, be able to take a pause, use this pandemic as a time to say, I think something needs to change. This is a message that, like, as we started, it's pulling back the curtain on things, and it's asking us to see what's behind there. And that we should be giving ourselves that space and time, and moving forward. I think there shouldn't be a lot of frenzy of activity around making new policy, making new changes and decisions. It should be space for stuff like this kind of dialogue we've been having, for everybody to listen to one another, and draw upon strengths. What are the strengths that we have in our community as leaders and thinkers and people who care, and then move those things forward, come together and move those things forward. That's what I see as possibilities.
Thanks, Kris. There's always someone who has to go first. So thanks for taking one for the team. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Jamilah, let's go with you next. What are your final thoughts around, like, what is possible if we really breathe and imagine into that space?
Well, I feel like I'm in a like-minded group, so I don't think my answer will be wildly different from Kris's. You know, what's possible is doing what we have been doing, with more thoughtfulness and more care. We before COVID, we were doing good work around this notion of Common Core standards, and really messing up this notion of standards and looking at that critically. So how do we go back to that and see, okay, so we tried that, how did it go? What do we want to do differently, with the notion of personalized learning, and how was that implemented, and where did it end up kind of looking like what we already had? So how do we go back to the intention of that and re-examine that plan, to the equity literacy initiatives and the restorative practices initiatives that were going on in the state, and looking at where is that work going really well, who's really figuring it out and learning from one another through, like, processes like Kris is talking about, getting together and talking. What are you doing? What's working? Communicating and networking with one another. And then, it's continuing to examine the school funding, which I think Vermont has been in the process of trying to grapple with for some time, and kind of navigate how our commitment to local control bumps up against what we know is right in school funding. And then let's layer on top of that, what did we just learn about what's possible when we have to do the impossible? And what we learned was that when we get creative about education, we get outside, we do hybrid models, we have smaller class sizes. What are all those things we learned actually we didn't realize were going to work so well, and how do we hold on to that moving forward?
Thank you. Tanya.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Kris, are you sure you're not a social worker? Because you speak a lot like a social worker. Anyway.
I'm married to a former social worker who's now a therapist, mental health counselor. So you got it.
So what I will say is that the coronavirus crisis has obviously been horrible, and it has really sort of burned any facade that we had that things were working really well. But one thing I say in my practice a lot is that every crisis, while it presents us with real danger, it also presents us with opportunity. And in this moment, I think it presents us with an opportunity to rebuild from the ashes of what it has sort of burned down, something stronger, more resilient, and more intuitive that meets the needs of our teachers, that meets the needs of our students, that allows for outdoor learning that is proficiency-based rather than test score-based, that really, truly lifts up a thriving community. For too long, I think our education system, like many of our systems, has been kind of like replacing a broken window on a house with a broken foundation. And that foundation is going to continue to break the window over and over and over again. But what we have the opportunity to do right in this moment is rebuild that foundation and really say, what have we learned from this? And what do we know works? And how can we utilize the vast, amazing knowledge of our educators and our social workers and our communities to build community education that is really grounded in allowing us all to thrive. And that, for me, is what I hope we do from here. We could rebuild what we had, but why would we? We have an opportunity right now to take this moment and build something that truly sees each and every one of you here and each and every one of our students and each and every one of our communities in a way that values them, lifts them up, and allows them to be their whole selves.
Thanks, Tanya. All right, Elizabeth, you get the final word here. What is possible?
Well, I don't have any. I feel that something has been missing from this conversation, and so instead of giving you a talk about wrapping everything up, I want to make a plug for the United Faculty of the Vermont State College's plan for how to keep the Vermont State College system open, because I think it's actually a really fantastic steps that they've taken. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it has to do with creating a Vermont State University instead of Vermont State Colleges with several campuses, so that they would change how the governance structure works, which would also increase state allocation as a result of being a unified university. And they would redistribute public funds to strengthen equity, and they would. I have a page, unfortunately, which I received in the mail, but in the good old fashioned post office. But anyway, they hope to be able to offer a greatly reduced tuition rates as a result of all of their savings and expanded possibilities of lifelong learning to every Vermonter, which actually is gives I feel like we are forgetting about what happens after we leave our public school systems, where we should be, we should be engaged in education through the course of our entire lives. We're better people for it, right? And it again levels the playing field and lifts up the entire playing field in doing so. So that's what I wanted to make sure got mentioned.
Well, thanks, Elizabeth. I think it is very much, an answer to that question, because not only, first of all, higher ed is absolutely, completing the story. We actually didn't talk that much actually about pre-K either, right? The two ends of the education experience, or adult ed for that matter as well. So this conversation can keep going. And I often see that those elements of education get pitted against each other in state politics. And we have to really guard against that, because we're literally in it all together. But I do think that's, what that effort is doing is really reimagining what's possible around higher education and releasing the old mental models around a state college system that was only built a certain way, and finding a more sustainable and responsive way to educate Vermont youth who are going into higher ed. So I think that made total sense. So thanks for bringing that into the space. So we're at the point where we're going to wrap up. And so I'm going to thank all of our panelists for being on tonight. I know this is like in some ways past my bedtime, but I really appreciate you all bringing the energy and the passion and the fire to this conversation around education and economic justice. To everyone who's watching, I hope I am not the first. I know I'm not the first, but I won't be the last to really remind you that your vote matters, your voice matters in this process. The election is just less than 2 weeks away. Every elected office in Vermont is on the ballot, as it is every 2 years, and your vote really true matters. So get those ballots in to your local town clerks, return them in person if you need to on election day, and just make sure you complete those ballots and mail them in, sign and seal and deliver. We also have state reps candidates on the page or on the event tonight, and I just want to plug their websites because they could certainly need some help and donations in these final days of the campaign. So Tanya's website is tanyav4vt.com. That's tanyav4vt.com. So you can find out more ways to help her campaign, donations, volunteers, etc. And Elizabeth's campaign website is elizabethvt.com. That's Elizabeth spelled out vt.com. You can find me on social media, Emma4vthouse.com, although I'm running uncontested in the general. So I really strongly encourage you to find candidates that you feel passionate about, get out and support them. And most importantly, vote, vote, vote. So thank you all. Have a great night.